Almost all wildlife photographers shoot exclusively with super telephoto lenses. But for the past month, I've been shooting with only a 135mm f1.8 Sigma lens and have gotten some of my favorite photographs ever. Here are the reasons why I'll be shooting with this lens much more moving forward, but also some reasons why this lens is not a good buy for everyone. As opposed to most of my reviews recently, this lens wasn't sent to me by any company and I bought it straight up with my own money. To start off, this lens autofocuses quickly. However, I predict that even more importantly is its ability to manual focus incredibly effectively. Since this lens is more than double as wide as what is already considered the short side of super telephoto lenses at 300mm, and this lens is 5 times wider than most average 600mm lenses, it backs you out much further from subjects than your camera is used to. This means that many autofocus detection algorithms do struggle a little bit more in keeping up and finding the eye or the head of the bird, for example, since it's so tiny in frame. This requires more skill then as a photographer to do lots of correcting by manual focusing, of which this lens is well suited for. The manual focus ring is buttery smooth and heavier set, giving it a very fine touch that allows for you to finesse the perfect manual focus with the depth of field so shallow. Ultimately, this lens is the most effective implementation of a manual focus ring that I've ever used in wildlife photography. And I'd say that that's one area I'm qualified to judge in if you know my background. As a downside, this lens has no image stabilization built into it. However, with pretty much all modern day mirrorless camera bodies, the image stabilization built into the camera body alone is enough to make up for this. Since you're backed out much wider than normal, much less stabilization is needed to achieve stable footage or allow for shooting in lower light. So I view it as a pretty minor problem for 90% of photographers. Speaking of low light, as you've already seen, this lens is an f1.8, which sounds like a lens made out of heaven for wildlife photographers who are used to a 6.3 on average or a 2.8 at best. To give an idea of how big a difference this is in light gathering capability and depth of field, allow me to give an example really quick. Let's start out with your average light gathering capability of 6.3. If you lower your f-stop by 3 clicks, you'll arrive at a single full stop lower. 6.3 goes to 5.6, 5.6 to 5.0, and 5.0 goes to 4.5. If our ISO was that of 12,800, we're now able to lower our ISO a full stop down to 6,400 ISO to improve our light gathering capabilities and bringing a more shallow depth of field. Let's move down again from 4.5 to 4.0 to 3.5 to 3.2. At 4.0, we already passed many of the popular super telephoto prime numbers and are passing under this. By 3.2, we have now lowered our ISO down to 3,200. Let's keep going down from 3.2 to 2.5. At 2.5, we pass now the lowest super telephoto primes that exist. Let's keep going down one more time and now move down to 2.2, 2.0, and then finally 1.8. At 1.8, we have finally reached our destination with 800 ISO and an incredibly more shallow depth of field at the given focal length. To put this in a real-life example, what you would be capturing with an average super telephoto zoom lens at ISO 12,800 can now be captured at 800 ISO on this 135mm lens, a full 4 stops lower. This is an immense difference. Low light is virtually non-existent with this lens, and if you can see it with your naked eyes, you can pretty much shoot it with almost any modern camera at usable shutter speeds. Low light isn't the only reason to use this lens though. Even though it is wider, the depth of field achieved is so shallow that it allows for incredible shots that feel isolated and simplified in all the right areas, while still capturing the scene all around the subject. I personally have fallen in love with the ability to capture the features and scene all around the wildlife subject with this lens, while still blurring most of those elements enough to keep them from being a distraction. I haven't even gotten to the most impressive part yet, but first, let me quickly touch on build quality. This lens is heavy, and it's surprising how much it weighs when it's only at 135mm. It comes in at 1,200 grams, which is almost double the weight of most full-frame mirrorless bodies, and weighs significantly more than both the latest Panasonic 100-400 and Olympus 300mm MFT lenses I recently tested. Obviously, compared to big full-frame super telephoto primes, this lens is still just baby weight, but it just is important to note that it's deceivingly heavy for its size. There also is no lens foot on it, which could be a downside, but I suspect that few people, if any, would use this on a tripod anyways. Other than these things, the build quality is unquestionably perfect in my opinion, and it feels like a tank. The manual focus ring is phenomenal, just as I mentioned before, and it's a prime, so there's no moving zoom parts you need to be worried about. So now let's talk about the most important part, glass quality. The glass quality on this lens is ridiculously sharp. So sharp that it is one of those rare situations in wildlife photography that truly allows that high 50 megapixel camera to shine. To start off with an example, check out an image that I took fully zoomed out like this and see how far I can zoom in without significant loss in detail. It's truly incredible, and by this far in the zoom, the actual pixels on the camera start to affect sharpness before the glass does. So here's another thing to note. Because this lens is so shallow in combination with this sharpness, it actually allows for a crop like this to look pretty decent. Normally, when you take a shot at a higher aperture and heavily crop in, you find that the image just looks significantly worse due to the sharpness loss and depth of field no longer looking so shallow. But with this 1.8, a substantially heavy crop, such as this one, looks pretty similar to as if it was originally shot on something like a 400mm f5.6. This allowed me not to feel so bad while I was out in the field and feel like I was missing all my close-up opportunities, since I knew that in many situations I could crop in with my heavy megapixel sensor in a pinch. All that to say, this lens is pretty much perfectly sharp, and so sharp that you may not be able to use it to the fullest unless you have one of those highest megapixel cameras. Corner-to-corner sharpness is also perfectly sound, and I have no complaints there. This lens has revolutionized the way that I will be doing wildlife photography moving forward. It's giving me a whole new perspective of subjects and has honestly been a really fresh change of pace from the usual ways that I'm used to capturing wildlife. So beyond myself, who is this camera for? I think that this lens is for the advanced wildlife photographer looking to elevate their wildlife photography in a new way that they have never attempted before. Because this lens is wider, it does require a more advanced knowledge of lighting and composition to be able to create stunning images. And this tells me that this isn't the right buy for someone more on a beginner level. But because of its unusually wide angle for wildlife photography, there are few images like it that exist out there in the world. And for the experienced wildlife photographer with some vision, I believe that it can be an incredibly powerful tool in their hands. It makes me feel as if every time I'm out capturing a wood duck or let's say a scrub jay at these focal lengths, I'm doing so for the first time ever in my career. And I'm confident that many seasoned photographers will feel the same. The technicals of this lens are everything I think it needs to be, as it's tack sharp and well built. And for the wildlife photography pro who is used to paying $2,000, $5,000, or even $10,000 plus for a Super Telephoto Prime, this $1,000 lens is a walk in the park. If you want to see more reviews like this, I'd be honored if you subscribe to the channel below. And if you want to check out my month-long test of the Sigma 135mm out in the field doing bird photography, check out this video here in the end screen.